still have nightmares about the sound of those massive footsteps approaching my cabin in the dead of night. Not the light padding of a bear or the scattered hoofbeats of deer, but the deliberate, earth-shaking thuds of something enormous walking upright through the forest. Something that shouldn't exist, yet stood 8 feet tall in my doorway, cradling a dying infant in its massive arms. People ask me why I quit my dream job as a forest ranger after just 6 months, why I moved to the city and refused to set foot in the wilderness ever again. They assume it was the isolation, the harsh conditions, or simply a career change. They have no idea that I witnessed something that night that shattered everything I thought I knew about the natural world, and that the most terrifying part wasn't the creature itself, but the desperate trust it placed in me when it had nowhere else to turn. What I'm about to tell you happened many years ago in the remote wilderness of the Cascade Mountains. I've never shared this story publicly before, and those few people I've told either dismissed it as stress-induced hallucination or begged me to keep quiet. But the memory haunts me every single night, and I can't carry this burden of knowledge alone anymore. My name is Debbie Denver, and I'm a forest ranger specializing in climate research and ecosystem monitoring. What I witnessed during one terrifying weekend in November would forever change how I view the wilderness and the creatures that inhabit its darkest corners. When I first accepted the position at the remote monitoring station, I thought I understood what isolation meant. I had spent years studying in various wilderness locations, collecting data on temperature fluctuations, wildlife migration patterns, and the effects of climate change on old-growth forests. This particular assignment was supposed to be routine, a year-long study of microclimates in one of the most pristine wilderness areas in the Pacific Northwest. The station itself was a modest log cabin equipped with solar panels, a generator, and all the scientific equipment I needed for my research. My colleague, a weathered man in his 60s, who had been working these mountains for over 2 decades, served as my guide and mentor during the initial months. He was a quiet man, methodical in his approach, and possessed an almost supernatural knowledge of the forest around us. From the very beginning, something about his behavior struck me as unusual. He moved through the forest with the careful precision of someone who knew he was being watched. Every footstep was deliberate, every branch pushed aside with minimal noise. When we worked inside the cabin, he insisted on keeping our voices low, even when discussing routine scientific matters. He would often pause mid-sentence, tilting his head as if listening for something I couldn't hear. The local legends didn't help matters. The nearby town was full of stories about massive creatures roaming the deep wilderness. 8-foot-tall humanoids covered in dark fur, leaving enormous footprints in the soft earth near streams and clearings. The locals called them by various names, but most simply referred to them as the mountain people, or the ones who watch. I had dismissed these tales as typical rural folklore, the kind of stories that emerged naturally in isolated communities surrounded by vast, unexplored wilderness. My colleague never directly mentioned these legends, but his behavior suggested he took them seriously. He would often remind me to secure all food in the metal storage containers, not just to prevent bear encounters, but for reasons he never fully explained. He taught me to recognize certain signs in the forest: broken branches at unusual heights, strange arrangements of stones, and areas where the usual forest sounds seemed mysteriously absent. The Friday before my colleague left for his week-long vacation, his demeanor shifted noticeably. He had been preparing for his departure for days, going through equipment checklists and reviewing emergency procedures with an intensity that seemed excessive for a routine absence. As the afternoon wore on, I could sense his reluctance to leave, though he never explicitly expressed his concerns. As evening approached, he gathered his belongings and prepared to make the long drive back to town. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of decomposing leaves and the promise of winter's approach. I stood in the doorway, watching him load his truck, when he suddenly stopped and turned to face me. His expression was grave, more serious than I had ever seen him. He approached the cabin door, his weathered hands gripping the frame as he leaned in closer. The intensity in his eyes was unsettling, not the casual concern of a colleague leaving for vacation, but something deeper, more urgent. He spoke slowly, carefully choosing each word. He told me that if I heard strange sounds during the night, sounds that didn't match any known wildlife, I should remain inside the cabin. He emphasized that under no circumstances should I open the door if I suspected something unusual was outside. His voice carried a weight that made my skin crawl. Most disturbing was his final instruction: don't be a hero. He repeated this phrase several times as if it were a mantra I needed to memorize. The way he said it suggested he had specific knowledge about what might happen, knowledge he wasn't willing to share directly. After he left, I found myself alone in the cabin for the first time since arriving at the station. The silence was overwhelming, not the peaceful quiet of nature, but an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against the windows and walls. I tried to focus on my work, reviewing data, and preparing for the weekend's research activities, but my colleague's warning echoed in my mind. Saturday morning began normally enough. I prepared my equipment for a day of soil sampling and temperature monitoring in the forest's lower elevations. The weather was overcast but stable, with temperatures hovering just above freezing. Perfect conditions for the type of fieldwork I had planned. I spent the morning hours working methodically through my designated research areas, collecting samples and recording measurements. The forest seemed typical for late autumn. Most birds had migrated south, leaving behind the hardier species that would endure the mountain winter. Squirrels chattered occasionally in the distance, and I spotted deer tracks in the soft earth near a small stream. Around noon, as I worked near a grove of ancient Douglas firs, I began to notice subtle changes in the forest's atmosphere. The usual background sounds, wind through branches, distant bird calls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, gradually diminished. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong to any animal I could identify. It was low-pitched, almost like a moan, but with an underlying quality that raised the hair on my arms. The sound seemed to come from deep within the forest, perhaps a quarter mile away. It was followed by another similar sound from a different direction. My scientific training told me to investigate, to document and analyze this unusual phenomenon. But my colleague's warning echoed in my mind, and something primal in my brain urged me to retreat. I had never experienced such a strong flight response to an unknown sound. As I packed my equipment, the sounds continued intermittently. They were difficult to describe, not quite howls, not quite groans, but something that seemed to combine elements of both. Most unsettling was their apparent intelligence. These weren't random animal vocalizations, but seemed to follow patterns, as if different creatures were communicating across vast distances. I made my way back to the cabin more quickly than usual, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest that had seemed familiar and welcoming just hours before now felt alien and threatening. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. Every rustle in the underbrush made me freeze with anticipation. Once safely inside the cabin, I tried to rationalize what I had experienced. Perhaps the sounds were simply elk or deer vocalizations I hadn't encountered before. Mountain lions were known to make unusual sounds during mating season. Even bears, though they should have been preparing for hibernation, occasionally produced strange vocalizations. But as darkness fell, my attempts at logical explanation crumbled. The first sound came around 9 o'clock, a tremendous crack that echoed through the valley like a gunshot. It was followed by another, then another. These weren't the typical sounds of trees falling in the wind, but something more violent, more deliberate. It sounded as if massive trees were being deliberately snapped in half. Between the tree crashes, I began to hear other sounds that defied classification. There were roars that seemed too deep and powerful to come from any known predator. Mixed with these were higher-pitched screams that contained an almost human quality, yet were clearly not human in origin. The battle, for that's what it clearly was, continued for hours. The sounds moved through the forest in patterns that suggested multiple large creatures engaged in some kind of territorial dispute. I could hear the distinctive growl of a mountain lion, but it was accompanied by something else, something that made the big cat's vocalizations seem almost delicate by comparison. As the night progressed, the sounds became more intense and varied. I began to distinguish between different types of vocalizations, each suggesting creatures of different sizes and temperaments. There were low, rumbling growls that seemed to emanate from deep within massive chests. These were punctuated by higher-pitched calls that carried across the valley like distress signals or rallying cries. The pattern of sound suggested a complex interaction, not just a simple predator-prey encounter, but something resembling a coordinated defense. The deeper voices seemed to be responding to the mountain lion's attacks, while the higher calls appeared to be coordination signals. It was as if I was listening to a family or group working together to protect one of their own. Around 10:30, the nature of the conflict changed dramatically. What had been a series of discrete encounters became a sustained battle. The sound of splintering wood intensified, suggesting that trees were being used as weapons or barriers. I could hear what sounded like massive objects being hurled through the forest, followed by impacts that shook the ground beneath the cabin. The mountain lion's screams became more frequent and desperate. These weren't the confident roars of a predator in control, but the panicked cries of an animal that had encountered something far beyond its ability to handle. Between the cat's vocalizations, I could hear heavy breathing and what sounded like deliberate, strategic movement through the underbrush. At one point, the battle moved close enough to the cabin that I could distinguish individual sounds with terrifying clarity. The snap of breaking branches was accompanied by the heavy thud of massive feet moving at surprising speed. Whatever was fighting the mountain lion was not only larger than any known forest creature, but also possessed an intelligence and coordination that was deeply unsettling. The most disturbing moment came when I heard what could only be described as communication during combat. Between the sounds of physical confrontation, there were brief exchanges of vocalizations that carried the unmistakable cadence of language. Not human language, but organized sound patterns that suggested complex thought and strategic planning. These creatures, for I now understood that multiple entities were involved, were not simply acting on instinct. They were coordinating their actions, sharing information, and adapting their tactics in real time. The realization sent chills down my spine as I considered the implications of such intelligence in creatures that officially didn't exist. The geographical scope of the battle was staggering. Sounds echoed from multiple directions, suggesting that the conflict covered several acres of forest. At times, the action seemed to split into smaller engagements, only to reconverge in earth-shaking confrontations that left me pressing my hands against my ears. During a brief lull around 11:15, I heard something that nearly made me abandon my colleagues' warnings and venture outside. A sound of unmistakable distress. Not the aggressive roars or strategic communications I had been hearing, but something that sounded heartbreakingly similar to a crying child. The sound was deeper and more resonant than human crying, but the emotional content was unmistakable. This cry of distress was answered immediately by what could only be described as comforting sounds. Deep, rhythmic vocalizations that carried the same soothing quality as a parent consoling an injured child. The tenderness in these sounds was so profound that it momentarily overcame my fear, replacing it with an unexpected sense of empathy for whatever was suffering in the darkness. The mountain lion's attacks intensified in response to these vulnerable sounds, suggesting that the predator was attempting to exploit what it perceived as weakness. But its increased aggression was met with a fury unlike anything I'd ever heard. The protective roars that followed shook the cabin's walls and sent small objects tumbling from shelves. As midnight approached, the tide of battle clearly turned. The mountain lion's vocalizations became sporadic and desperate, while the deeper voices of its opponents grew more confident and coordinated. There were sounds of pursuit, heavy footsteps moving rapidly through the forest, accompanied by the crash of vegetation being demolished in the chase. The final phase of the battle was brief but decisive. A series of impacts that sounded like boulders being hurled was followed by one last defiant scream from the mountain lion. Then, abruptly, the predator's voice was silenced. The only sounds that remained were the heavy breathing of exhausted victors and the continued soft crying of whatever had been injured during the conflict. I sat in the cabin's main room, rifle across my lap, listening to this prehistoric conflict unfold in the darkness beyond my walls. The sounds were simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. As a scientist, I was desperate to understand what was happening. As a human being alone in a remote cabin, I was grateful for the solid log walls that separated me from whatever was fighting out there. The aftermath of the battle was almost as unsettling as the conflict itself. I could hear movement in the forest, not the chaotic sounds of combat, but deliberate, purposeful activity. There were soft vocalizations that suggested some form of medical attention being provided to the injured party. The tender quality of these sounds was in stark contrast to the violence that had preceded them. The battle reached its climax around midnight. A series of roars and screams echoed through the valley, followed by several more massive tree crashes. Then, gradually, the sounds began to diminish. By 1 o'clock, the forest had returned to its unnatural silence. I remained awake for another hour, listening intently for any sign that the conflict might resume. But the only sounds were the gentle creaking of the cabin's timber and the distant hoot of an owl, normal night sounds that seemed almost absurdly peaceful after what I had witnessed. I must have dozed off in my chair because I was startled awake by a sound that made my blood freeze. Footsteps, not the light patter of deer or the padding of a bear, but heavy, deliberate steps that suggested a bipedal creature of enormous size. The steps were approaching the cabin from the north, moving slowly and steadily through the forest. Each footfall seemed to shake the ground, and I could hear branches snapping under the weight of whatever was making its way toward me. The rhythm was unmistakably that of a two-legged creature walking upright. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a person? But no human could make such heavy footsteps, and what would someone be doing in this remote location at 2 a.m? A bear walking on its hind legs? Possible, but the steady rhythm suggested something that naturally walked upright rather than a bear's awkward bipedal shuffle. The footsteps continued their steady approach, and I realized they were heading directly for the cabin. There was no randomness to the path, no hesitation or change in direction. Whatever was out there knew exactly where it was going. I gripped my rifle tighter, my hands trembling despite my efforts to remain calm. My colleague's warning echoed in my mind. Stay inside, don't open the door, don't be a hero. But as the footsteps drew closer, curiosity began to wage war with caution. The steps stopped approximately 20 feet from the cabin's front door. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the approaching footsteps had been. I could sense a presence outside, something large and intelligent waiting in the darkness. Minutes passed. I remained frozen in my chair, barely breathing, straining to hear any sound that might indicate what was happening outside. Then, unexpectedly, I heard something that made my heart race. A low, rumbling sound that was almost like a whimper, but deeper and more complex than any animal sound I had ever heard. It was a sound of distress, of desperation, and it was coming from directly outside my door. Against every instinct, against my colleague's explicit warnings, I found myself standing and moving toward the door. The sound of distress continued, and something in its tone suggested urgent need rather than threat. My scientific curiosity, dormant during the terrifying sounds of the night's battle, reasserted itself. I approached the door slowly, rifle ready, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The smart thing would have been to remain inside, to wait until morning, to maintain the barrier between myself and whatever was outside. But the sounds of distress continued, and they tugged at something deeper than fear or caution. I opened the door just a crack, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. The forest was pitch black, with only the faintest starlight filtering through the canopy above. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out a shape in the clearing in front of the cabin. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb what little light was available. The creature was humanoid in shape, but proportioned like no human I'd ever seen. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its arms longer than they should have been, its chest deep and barrel-shaped. This was no bear, no known primate, no creature from any zoology textbook. But what made me open the door wider, what overrode every survival instinct I possessed, was what the creature was carrying. In its enormous arms, cradled with surprising gentleness, was a smaller version of itself. An infant, perhaps 3 feet tall, covered in the same dark fur as its parent. But this smaller creature was motionless, and even in the dim light, I could see dark stains on its fur near the shoulder and neck area. The adult creature, for I now realized I was looking at a mother and her injured child, took a step closer to the cabin. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out, and fell to the floor. The rifle clattered beside me as I scrambled away from the door. The mother creature approached slowly, stopping just outside the doorway. She made no aggressive movements, no threatening gestures. Instead, she knelt in the dirt and gently placed her injured offspring on the ground. Then, with one massive hand, she pointed to the wound on the infant's shoulder. In that moment, despite my terror, I understood. This mother had brought her dying child to me for help. The wound was severe, a series of puncture marks and tears that looked like they had been made by large claws or teeth. The mountain lion, I realized. The battle I had heard earlier wasn't just a territorial dispute. It was a mother defending her child. And from the looks of the wounds, the defense had almost come too late. The infant was unconscious, its breathing shallow and labored. Blood had matted the fur around the wound, and I could see that infection was already setting in. Without immediate medical attention, the creature would almost certainly die. I looked up at the mother still kneeling in the dirt, her eyes fixed on mine. There was intelligence in that gaze, a desperate hope that I might be able to help her child. But there was also something else, a barely contained ferocity that suggested she would not hesitate to tear me apart if I caused her offspring any harm. My first aid kit was designed for treating human injuries, but the basic principles would be the same. I needed to clean the wound, stop the bleeding, and prevent infection. The question was whether this creature would allow me to get close enough to provide treatment. I stood slowly, keeping my hands visible, and moved to retrieve my medical supplies. The mother watched my every movement, her massive form tensed and ready to spring into action if I made any threatening gestures. I had never felt such intense scrutiny, such a combination of hope and warning in a single gaze. Kneeling beside the injured infant, I began to assess the wounds more carefully. The claws had penetrated deep into the shoulder muscle, narrowly missing vital blood vessels. The creature was lucky to be alive, but without proper treatment, sepsis would set in within hours. Working with trembling hands, I began to clean the wounds with antiseptic solution. The infant stirred at the sting of the disinfectant, letting out a small whimper that nearly broke my heart. The mother responded immediately, making soft, rumbling sounds that were clearly meant to comfort her child. As I worked, I became aware of the mother's intense focus on my every movement. Her breathing was controlled but rapid, and I could see the tension in her massive shoulders. She was ready to intervene at the first sign that I might be causing unnecessary pain or harm. I irrigated the wounds thoroughly, then began the delicate process of suturing the deeper lacerations. The infant's skin was thicker than human skin, but the needle and thread from my kit were adequate for the job. As I worked, I found myself falling into the focused concentration that had served me well during my scientific career. The mother continued her soft, rumbling sounds, occasionally reaching out to gently stroke her child's head. The gestures were so tender, so obviously loving, that I had to remind myself I was treating a creature that could crush me without effort. After closing the wounds, I applied antibiotic ointment and wrapped the injured area in sterile bandages. The infant's breathing seemed to improve slightly, though it remained unconscious. From my kit, I retrieved a small vial of broad-spectrum antibiotics and a vitamin injection. Both would help the creature's immune system fight off infection. Administering the injections required me to work even closer to the mother, and I could feel her hot breath on my neck as she leaned in to observe. The smell was not unpleasant, earthy and wild like the forest itself, but the sheer power radiating from her massive form was overwhelming. When I had finished treating the wounds and administering the medications, I sat back on my heels and looked up at the mother. Using hand gestures, I tried to communicate that I had done everything I could. The bandages would need to be changed in a few days, and the infant would require rest and care to fully recover. The mother studied my work for several long moments, her intelligent eyes examining the bandages and the areas around the wounds. Then, with surprising gentleness, she lifted her child and cradled it against her chest. The infant stirred slightly, letting out a soft sound that might have been contentment. For a moment, mother and child remained in front of the cabin, and I thought I saw something like gratitude in the mother's eyes. Then, without warning, she turned and began walking back toward the forest. Her massive footsteps, which had terrified me just an hour before, now seemed to carry a weight of profound sadness mixed with hope. I watched from the doorway as the two figures disappeared into the darkness. The sound of heavy footsteps gradually faded, leaving me alone with the silence of the forest and the reality of what had just occurred. Standing in the doorway of the cabin, I tried to process what I had experienced. Every scientific principle I'd ever learned told me that what had just happened was impossible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. I had just provided medical treatment to a creature that wasn't supposed to exist, at the request of its mother. The rest of the night passed in a blur of disbelief and exhaustion. I cleaned up the medical supplies, noting the dark stains on the bandages and the unmistakable evidence of what had transpired. As dawn approached, I found myself questioning not just what I had witnessed, but my entire understanding of the natural world. My colleague returned the following Monday, and I could see immediately that something in my demeanor had changed. He studied my face as I recounted the events of the weekend, his expression growing increasingly grave. When I finished my story, he stood silently for several long minutes, staring out the cabin window into the forest. Finally, he turned to me with an expression I had never seen before. He wasn't surprised by my account. If anything, he seemed to have been expecting something like this. His reaction confirmed what I had begun to suspect. He had encountered these creatures before, and his careful behavior during our months working together had been based on direct experience rather than superstition. He told me that some things in the forest were better left undiscussed, that there were aspects of the wilderness that couldn't be explained or documented in any meaningful way. His words carried the weight of someone who had spent decades learning to coexist with forces beyond human understanding. He made me promise to keep what I had experienced to myself, emphasizing that no one would believe the story anyway. But more than that, he suggested that publicizing such encounters could be dangerous, both for the creatures involved and for the people who stumbled upon them. In the weeks that followed, I attempted to return to my normal research routine, but everything had changed. Every sound in the forest took on new significance. Every shadow might hide something extraordinary. The scientific detachment that had served me well throughout my career was replaced by a constant awareness that I was a visitor in a world far more complex and mysterious than I had ever imagined. I tried to contact colleagues at universities, wildlife organizations, and cryptozoology groups, but my colleagues' prediction proved accurate. Those who didn't dismiss my account outright suggested that stress and isolation had caused hallucinations. Without physical evidence, photographs, hair samples, or other tangible proof, my story was relegated to the realm of fantasy. The lack of belief from the scientific community was almost as distressing as the encounter itself. I had spent my career studying the natural world, building a reputation based on careful observation and rigorous methodology. To have the most significant discovery of my life dismissed as delusion was professionally devastating. Sleep became elusive. I would lie awake listening to every sound outside the cabin, wondering if the mother creature might return with her child, or if other members of her species might approach seeking similar help. The forest that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a place where anything might emerge from the shadows. 2 months after the encounter, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I submitted my resignation from the Forest Service, citing personal reasons and a desire to pursue opportunities in urban environments. My colleague accepted my decision without surprise, though I could see sadness in his eyes at losing someone who had been granted such a rare glimpse into the forest's deepest secrets. The transition to city life was jarring. After months of silence broken only by natural sounds, the constant noise of traffic, construction, and urban activity felt overwhelming. But it was a price I was willing to pay for the psychological distance it provided from my experience in the wilderness. I found work with an environmental consulting firm focusing on urban sustainability projects and climate adaptation strategies. The work was meaningful and challenging, but it lacked the profound connection to nature that had originally drawn me to forestry. Still, it allowed me to contribute to environmental protection while maintaining the safe distance I needed from the wild places that had shown me their most closely guarded secrets. Years have passed since that November night, and I've never returned to the wilderness in a professional capacity. Camping trips, hiking excursions, and nature photography, activities that once brought me joy, now hold no appeal. The knowledge of what exists in the deep forests has transformed my relationship with the natural world in ways I never could have anticipated. I often wonder about the infant I treated that night. Did it survive? Did the antibiotics and careful wound care allow it to heal properly? I like to imagine that somewhere in the Pacific Northwest wilderness, a young creature carries scars from a mountain lion attack but lives because of the intervention of a terrified forest ranger who chose to help rather than hide. The mother's face haunts my dreams, not as a nightmare, but as a reminder of the profound trust she placed in me during her child's most vulnerable moment. In choosing to approach a human for help, she had risked not only her own safety, but the secrecy that had protected her species for countless generations. Sometimes I question whether I made the right choice in treating the injured infant. By helping, I may have inadvertently encouraged future contact between humans and these creatures. But in that moment, faced with a dying child and a desperate mother, the decision had been instinctive and unequivocal. The isolation of possessing such knowledge, of knowing that creatures of myth and legend are real, living beings with complex social structures and emotional lives, is a burden I hadn't anticipated. I belong to a tiny fraternity of people who have encountered these beings, and the inability to share this knowledge with the broader world creates a profound sense of disconnection. I have learned to live with the weight of this secret, to function normally in a world where my most significant professional experience cannot be acknowledged or discussed. The skills I developed as a scientist, observation, analysis, and documentation, seem almost irrelevant when applied to phenomena that exist beyond the boundaries of accepted scientific understanding. In quiet moments, I sometimes wonder if my colleague is still working at the remote station, still maintaining the careful protocols that allow humans and these mysterious creatures to coexist in the same wilderness. I hope that others who follow in my footsteps will be better prepared for the possibility of such encounters, and that they will have the wisdom to respect the boundaries that separate our worlds. The experience has fundamentally changed how I view the relationship between humans and the natural world. We approach wilderness with the assumption that we are the dominant species, that our scientific understanding encompasses all significant life forms on Earth. My encounter revealed the hubris inherent in this assumption. There are beings in the deep forests who have developed their own complex societies, their own methods of survival, their own ways of understanding the world around them. They have learned to avoid human contact not out of fear, but out of a sophisticated understanding that coexistence requires careful boundaries and mutual respect. The mother who brought her injured child to me had made a calculated decision, weighing the risks of human contact against the potential benefits of accessing medical knowledge her species did not possess. It was a decision that required not only courage, but a complex understanding of interspecies dynamics. In the years since leaving the Forest Service, I have come to appreciate the wisdom of my colleagues' approach, the careful protocols, the respectful distance, the understanding that some aspects of the natural world are meant to remain mysterious. The modern world's insistence on cataloging, studying, and explaining every phenomenon would be profoundly disruptive to beings who have survived by remaining hidden. I have never regretted my decision to help the injured infant that night, despite the personal and professional costs of the encounter. In that moment, the barriers between species dissolved, leaving only the universal bond between beings who care for their young. The mother's trust in me, desperate though it was, represents one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. The forest continues to exist, vast and mysterious, holding secrets that may never be fully understood by human science. I like to think that somewhere in those deep woods, the creatures I encountered that night continue their ancient way of life, protected by the silence of those few humans who have been granted glimpses into their world. My story serves as a reminder that the natural world still holds mysteries beyond our comprehension, that the wilderness is not simply a collection of resources to be managed and studied, but a living system that includes beings whose existence challenges our fundamental assumptions about life on Earth. For those who work in remote wilderness areas, who spend their nights alone in cabins surrounded by the vast unknown, I offer this advice. Approach the forest with humility, respect the boundaries that separate the human world from the deep wild, and remember that sometimes the greatest discoveries are those that must remain forever undocumented. The truth is out there, walking silently through the deepest forests, raising their young and living their lives in the shadows between myth and reality. And sometimes, in moments of desperate need, that truth reveals itself to those who have the wisdom to help rather than exploit, to protect rather than expose. For more interesting stories like this one, check out this incredibly disturbing one.